Hello, it is 2021 and a lot of people are posting or pondering about what the invitation or the word for the year is. And as I've been kind of sitting with this question and wondering, what's going to happen, I would actually say that in my season of rest, I am more and more convinced that the Lord has us on the brink of something great as a church. Big C church, as Christ followers. I think in the world, even with kind of being on lockdown and seeing the numbers go up, I think that there is something big happening. And so the question I've been asking myself is, how do we prepare? How do we get ready for what God wants to do, I think, not only in us, but also through us? And I was reflecting a couple of weeks ago on 1 Kings 19. I love that passage for a number of different reasons. But personally, I've been reflecting and identifying with kind of Elijah's need for rest and his desire for community or other people who have the zeal that he has. But the verses that I got stuck on when I was preparing and thinking about it, my heart kind of started to burn within me, is this little story in 1 Kings 19 verses 19 to 21. And is when Elijah comes and throws his mantle over Elijah. And so I want to just spend a couple minutes with you today talking about being all in for 2021. I want to be ready for what God is doing. I think there is massive amount of change that is going to happen. And how do we prepare for that change? I think this story for me is a good reminder, has some good invitations of what we can do in order to get ready for the Lord to move. And so if you want to read those verses, go ahead. I'm actually just going to go through them very briefly and point out some things that I've observed and some things that have made me reflect on what God might be doing in this story, and then possibly the invitation for me and maybe for us as we look at the year. So Elijah goes down, and Elijah's just had this conversation with the Lord in a cave. He has spent a very fearful time. I would encourage you even to read those couple of chapters before. It's quite the journey he's been on. But he's been commanded by the Lord in verse 16 to go and anoint Elisha. And Elisha, is plowing with 12 yoke of oxen, and he himself is driving the 12th pair. Now, this is interesting because it tells us two things right off the bat. One, Elisha is not from a family that is poor. If his family has 12 yoke of oxen, it is also likely they had enough fields to need that many oxen and to feed that many oxen. So his farming family is not a family of subsistence farming. It's not, kind of feeding the family and maybe trading some goods. He is from a family of some wealth. The second thing that verse tells us is Elisha himself is driving a pair of oxen. Now, I'm sure there are servants who could have done it for him, likely also working with him. But this says something to us about Elisha's character. He understands, that hard work is necessary, and perhaps even has plans and is learning the family business so he can take over, which would have been very common in farming agricultural society. So this young man's plowing the field, and, in the distance, he sees this man come towards him. And we read that Elijah goes up to Elisha and throws his cloak on him. Now, we'll just pause there again, because I think sometimes, just because we don't have cultural context, we can miss what is happening here. This isn't simply like an overcoat. Canadians right now, we're wearing a lot of like double and extra layers, but they're very fitted to keep us warm. It's not this type of overcoat. It is sort of more like a large blanket or mantle, as some translations have, that would have been in the shape or used for not only keeping warm, but like carrying things and also sleeping under, but particularly for the Jewish reader of this story. And Elisha, as he's experiencing it, this mantle would have only been worn by three types of people: prophets, priests, and kings. And so he sees this man coming towards him with a prophet mantle. And then this man says nothing to him. We're indicating in our text, nothing gets said. This mantle gets thrown on Elisha. Elisha, in that moment, would have understood that his life is about to change. Now, if we can just imagine the story and step into it, we see here a young person growing up in a family of some wealth, not necessarily inherited or assumed wealth, because we see that he understands he needs to work what has been given to him. And at that point, he has no other plans, and likely his parents have no other plans for him than to keep at the family business. That's why he's learning how to plow. That's why he's in the field, literally minding his own business, when along comes this man who very likely he would have heard of by reputation. This man, Elijah, has just, done some amazing feats, and you think of the sacrifice of Baal versus God, and fire rained down from heaven with God. Then Elijah deals with the priests there, and then he also ticks off Jezebel and Ahab and has to flee for his life. But then he has this moment of fear where he hides away in a cave with the Lord. And so Elijah is coming from that space of being afraid, and he throws over his mantle over this young man. And in this moment, imagine this young person kind of having this plan. He's been raised and primed to take over the business. You know what your plan is. And then God comes calling in the form of Elijah. Now, here's the thing. Have you ever had a moment like that? And perhaps it wasn't even a moment. Maybe it was sort of over a growing process over a couple of months or maybe a year that you realize your future isn't going to look like what you planned. I think, if I can say this, I think 2020 was a bit like that for all of us. We had plans for the year, and there was kind of this, slow dawning or awakening that it was not going to be what we thought it was. But I also think, if we're really honest, how much is really going to change now that it's 2021. Is there a slow dawning on us that perhaps, and I'm saying this as us as Christ followers, that things are not going to be the same going forward? That perhaps we need to be open to a new future than the one that we had planned. How do we stand in a moment like this? What's our response? And I think it's worthwhile some reflection of what is our initial personal response. When our plans change, we suddenly have this plan executed and it becomes plan B, or it gets taken away. What's our response? Do we want to go back to the plow? Imagine this young man just turns back like it never happened. Do we want to, go back home even and hide and kind of hope that things will just stay the way that they always were, the way we've always done it? Or do we want to run after it like Elisha does? I think it's worthwhile reflecting on this personally, because I do believe that identifying and allowing the Lord to kind of massage out of our hearts those things that we hold on to for surrendering our future gets in the way of us going all in for Him. And this is, I think, even more important in a moment like this in history, if I can say that. I don't exactly know what is going to happen, but I think to be open to what God could do, God could invite us into, is to let go of our future and the things we're hoping for, so that the Lord might use us in the ways that He has planned. So what's going to be our response in a moment like this? How are we going to respond? Well, I think it's worthwhile to take an example from Elisha. And if you look at verse 20 there, Elisha leaves his oxen and then he runs after Elijah, and he says, "Can I kiss my dad and mom, and then I'll follow you?" And what was so interesting there is that this actually tells us that he doesn't fully understand what has happened. He knows this moment is significant, and he's willing to say goodbye to mom and dad and follow Elijah. But his question, actually his phrase at the end there, says he doesn't get it, because he says, "I will follow you." And you can see that Elijah actually understands that this young man doesn't fully get what has just happened, because Elijah says to him, "Go back again, for what have I done to you?" Elijah sees that Elisha doesn't understand that this calling is from the Lord. And remember that Elijah knows this, because in verse 16, Elijah received this command from the Lord to anoint Elisha as the prophet. But the call for Elisha, he has to know that it is from the Lord and not Elijah. The call is from the Lord. Now, why is this important? I think I'm going to state kind of the simple answer is that because following God isn't always easy. And particularly in our story, the calling of a prophet is quite difficult. If you think about just what Elijah's been through in the last couple of chapters, he has been front row, actually, not maybe even on the stage for some of the amazing works of God, but then has reacted by questioning his own, his aloneness and fearing for his personal safety. And so Elijah understands that the struggles and the low points are also part of the journey of a prophet. And if Elisha, watches Elijah struggle and have the low points, and if Elisha experiences his own low points and difficulties as a prophet, and he thinks that it's linked to Elijah and not to God, when it gets tough, he's going to opt out. It's going to be hard to stick with the call. So Elijah really wants Elisha to understand it is God who has called you to be a prophet. It is God who is inviting you to follow him. It is not always going to be easy to follow Jesus, to follow God's call on your life, on the life of the church. There is going to be times that are going to be scary. There are going to be moments like Elisha's having in this field where you recognize that the future you had planned, the future that you had wanted, anticipated, might be slipping away through your fingers. But if you allow your hands to be open, could it be that there's actually something greater that we are being invited in this season to be a part of? It was interesting for me to reflect on the Christmas season, the humanity of Jesus. And I've been doing that a lot this year. But just to realize how committed our God, Jesus, was to the plan of salvation. Because we talk about the incarnation at Christmas and the vulnerability of becoming a human baby. But realizing that the moment that God became human flesh, came in the form of human flesh, there was no other plan for salvation. He was committed, he was all in a plan that will lead him to the cross. We have a God who understands what it is like to be human and limited, but also who models for us what it is like to be all in. And it's because he is all in that his Spirit can now empower us to say yes to being all in and letting go and surrendering our future. So, what is the response when the Lord comes calling on your life? What and how can we respond? So there's a personal element here, but I also want to recognize contextually there is a communal element here, a collective, I think, invitation for the church. We see in verse 21 that Elisha leaves Elijah and goes back. And he does something very interesting here. He takes his yoke of oxen and slaughters them. He burns the plowing equipment to cook the meat, and he gave it to the people, and they ate. So here's what's interesting about this. You kind of read it over so quickly, you almost don't notice that Elisha literally breaks all ties with his past and his future. He takes the yoke of oxen and he slaughters them. And he takes the very plow which he is using and he cooks the meat on that plow and feeds the meat to the word there's actually kin, so his family. Do you understand what he's doing here? Oxen are valuable. They would be worth years of harvest for this family. And he takes them and he sacrifices them. And then he literally gives away his future plan, his RSP, if you want to call it that. But to Elisha, there is no plan B. God's calling, he understands now, and so he wants to go all in. How do we respond when God comes calling? So I think there's probably some of us who are trying to figure out, what do we think about God's calling, inviting us into relationship with him? And perhaps if that's you and you're listening to that, you haven't yet made that commitment, you've been seeking, you've been wondering. I think perhaps the question is what is the plow in your life that you may need to burn? What is the thing in your life that may get in the way of you being all in? What is it that you need courage maybe to pluck out of your life? Maybe that's a relationship or a habit or a job. I don't know. What is that's going to have to be reflection on you personally, but just thinking about what is getting in the way to my yes. And if it is even your doubts or, you're wondering about your unworthiness, those things the Lord asks you to give him and trust that he will minister to you and actually provide for you when you're all in. And maybe, if you've been walking with the Lord for a number of years, I think probably the worthwhile question is asking yourself if you have maybe built a plan B. There's security that you have, and you've been living with the God and, as Tozer puts it, instead of just God himself. I like how he puts it, A.W. Tozer says, the evil habit of seeing God and effectively prevents us from finding God in his full revelation. In the and lies our greatest woe. If we omit the and, we will soon find God, and in him we shall find that for which we have all our lives been secretly longing. In other words, until we let go of that thing that we're adding on to God, or that security, or that plan B, we are never going to find what all in really means in Christ. I think also this is a moment for us as a church, a Big C church, that perhaps we are standing in this precipice where the Lord could be inviting us into a future that we thought looked different. Are we willing to let go of things that have been done because we've always done them this way, or the things maybe even, that we want for the future of our church, and allow the Lord to lead us into his vision for his bride? How are we going to be all in, letting go of what has been and what maybe even we want to go into in 2021 to let the Lord have his way? Because the other thing that isn't explicitly stated in the story, but is inferred in the story, and this is really interesting, that while he goes back, yes, and maybe he kisses his mom and dad, he also burns away part of, if not all of, their retirement plan. Elisha's choice of following God, his yes, his all in, cost his family. That word people there, actually in verse 21, can be translated as kin. So he actually sacrifices the oxen, burns the plow, and feeds his own family. They're literally eating away some of their future. There is a cost to saying yes to the call of God. So are we going to be the type of community, the type of spiritual family who watch others respond to the call of God in their lives and allow it to cost us? Or to become the type of church that is all in, and even if it costs us, we get a front row seat and maybe even invited into what God is doing? To allow others and ourselves to dream crazy dreams, to live in the fullness, as Tozer puts it, of God's revelation, without letting the mindset of what was in the past and what we hope for in the future to get in the way of what God wants to do. What does it mean to be all in 2021? There's this famous story in history. Actually, a song was written about it recently for King and Country called Burn the Ships. And I needed to do a little more exploring as a historian before I found out the facts of this story. But when Hernan Cortez wanted to see if he could get the Aztec gold that no one seemed to be able to do, this is in what is now modern day Mexico, he took 600 men and 11 ships to go and conquer the people, and particularly the treasure. And he got wind of a plan that his men some of them wanted to return and steal some of the ships and go back. And so he scuttled. I don't know if he burned them necessarily, meaning he sunk all of them but one. And that one ship he saved because it was going to take the tribute back to the King of Spain when they got this treasure. While there is still other options, Cortez understood that people will not be fully committed. You're going to be compromised. And while retreat is possible, we won't fully be on the front lines. When there's only one option, you not only go all in, but sometimes you're desperate enough that innovation, creativity, and energy, you discover you have way more than you ever dreamed possible. I don't know about you, but at the beginning of 2021, I want to be the type of person who wants to go all in for Jesus. I also want to be part of a family and part of a spiritual community and part of a church that encourages others to be all in for Jesus. To say yes to God completely, that there is nothing that holds us back, that hinders us from stepping forward into what the future has, because the reality is the world will and is changing. And I think as a result of that, the bride of Christ is going to need to be different. And if we can follow the Lord's heart and understand that as he calls us to himself, we see that Elisha's posture of understanding that it is God calling him, it brings him into the surrendering posture, as we read in that last verse, 21b, that he actually ministers to Elijah. Although he understands his calls to the Lord, he comes under him and actually is an answer to Elijah's prayer for companionship. Two men who are following the Lord find each other with the same all-inness. I am convinced that if we as individuals commit to being all in this year, we will find other people who are so committed to dream big dreams, do crazy things, reach people who haven't been reached yet, and also experience God in a whole new way. So are we willing to let everything go, surrendering not only our past, but our future, and be all in 2021?